Is a triangle a triangle? Section 7.2 in geometry. Is a triangle a triangle? We talked about this in a previous chapter, but it's time to revisit it. A triangle is a triangle. We need the sum of the two smaller sides must be greater than the third side. And here come my usual pens. I've got these two pens. If I add up these two sides, they have to be bigger than the third side that I put with it. Maybe I want to just put this little highlighter with it. Together, those two sides definitely add up more than the highlighter. Or I could put the highlighter and the pen together and say, how long are those? Together, they have to be bigger than this marker. What I can't do is say I'm going to use these two sides for sides of the triangle, and then I want this ruler to be my third side. Not going to work. Not if I want to go end to end. If I go end to end, this is going to flatten out completely, and there's not going to be enough space or an angle to make a triangle out of it. So two sides of the triangle have to end up being greater than the third side. So we'll ask, can 8 inches go with 3 inches and 2 inches? If you tried to put them together, of course you're going to add the two smaller numbers, because if you add the bigger number, it's not going to work. 5 is not bigger than the third side. If I put 3 inches here and 2 inches here, I'm not going to be able to make a full triangle. So be careful. You must check and see, is a triangle a triangle? Once you know that the triangle is a triangle, what kind is it? If a triangle is a triangle, what kind of triangle is it? So you already know the Pythagorean theorem. Now we're working on the converse of the Pythagorean theorem. We've done this before. We've done converses. We kind of switched the order. You know that if you have a right triangle, then a squared plus b squared equals c squared. We're going to go the other way around. If c squared equals a squared plus b squared, then it's a right triangle. Notice I put the hypotenuse first. Hypotenuse, normally you would say a squared plus b squared equals c squared, but there's a reason for that, because it makes more sense that if your c squared is equal, it's a right triangle. However, if your c squared is smaller or less than a squared plus b squared, then it's an acute triangle. So think about this, that why did I put c squared first? Because it makes sense. If you have a right triangle and your c squared gets smaller, then it's an acute triangle. It'll make it acute. Hang on, I got talking in the background. Okay, so there's c squared equal to a squared plus b squared. If c squared gets smaller, now you have an acute triangle. So it makes sense that smaller matches up with acute. Whatever happens to the hypotenuse, not a hypotenuse anymore because it went acute. What if c squared gets greater than a squared plus b squared? If c squared is greater than a squared plus b squared, then you have an obtuse triangle. So not only are we writing the Pythagorean theorem in the reverse order, but we're also doing the converse of the whole thing. Normally we would say, if it's a right triangle, then a squared plus b squared equals c squared. We're reversing the order of the statement and reversing the order of the Pythagorean theorem, just to make sure that the English matches the math. So I have 8, 7, and square root of 13. First thing you have to do is find out which one is the hypotenuse. If you know how big square root of 13 is in your head, 113, then you know that it's the hypotenuse. Or you could say, well, it's bigger than 100, and the square root of 100 is 10. So I know that square root of 113 is the hypotenuse. So that's my c squared. And I want to know, is c squared equal to, greater than, or less than a squared plus b squared? Order of these two doesn't matter. Okay, if I square root 113 squared, a square and a square root are inverses of each other. Take 8 squared plus 7 squared, and again, this is somewhere where I prefer that you don't write 64 plus 49, because you're probably going to use a calculator anyway. Just go ahead and put in 8 squared plus 7 squared, and you will get 113, sorry. 113 equals 113, therefore it is a right triangle. Try it with 38, 77, and 86. C squared is 86 squared. How does that compare to 38 squared plus 77 squared? 86 squared is 7,396. 38 squared plus 77 squared is 7,373. How does 7396 compare to 7373? It's just a little bit larger. What does that translate to? That you had a right triangle possibly, but C squared got larger, which makes this an obtuse triangle. 2, 4, and 7. And you're looking at that and you're going, oh, okay, I know. C squared. I know that 7 is the hypotenuse. I'm going to compare it to 4 squared plus 6 squared, but 4 squared plus 2 squared. But before you go any further, I'm going to tell you that you're wrong. Whether you say it's right, obtuse, or acute. Is it even a triangle? We have a 2, a 4, and a 7. 2 plus 4 is supposed to be bigger than 7, so I can make a triangle. So it is not a triangle. Should we have tested that up here? Probably. Did we test it? No, but in our heads we knew that 38 and 77 is definitely bigger than 86. So test your triangles first, make sure. This one we should test not only to find out if it's a triangle, but how big is 4 square root of 95? If you type in 4 square root of 95, you're going to get 38.98. Don't use a decimal format. You were just checking to see how big it is. 38.98 is bigger than 15 and 36, so you know that this is C. 15 plus 36 is definitely bigger than 38.98, so it is a triangle. You just have to be careful when you type in 4 square root of 95 squared. And we talked about this when we did radical review. If you are careful with it, you will use a double parentheses when your calculator gives you a parenthesis here and a parenthesis here. Make sure your 4 square root of 95 squared ends up being 1520. How does that compare to 15 squared plus 36 squared? You get 1521. It's going to look like a right triangle, but it's going to be just a little bit acute. Because C squared went just a little bit smaller than A squared plus B squared. Decimals, check your decimals. Are the two smaller sides bigger than the third side when you add it up? Yes. What's your third side? 37.5 squared. How does that compare to A squared, which is 10.5 squared, plus 36.5 squared? 37.5 squared, you get 1406.25. How does that compare to 10.5 squared plus 36.5 squared? 1442.5. It is a little smaller, therefore we have an acute triangle. Last one. Looks like we definitely have an isosceles triangle. Question is it isosceles acute, isosceles right, or isosceles obtuse? Is it even a triangle? Is the square root of 18 plus the square root of 18 bigger than the square root of 86? Test that first. Square root of 18 plus the square root of 18 is 8.49. How big is the square root of 36? We already know that is 6. So yeah, it's going to work. It is a real triangle. We're going to take C squared, compare it to A squared plus B squared. You can do this math if you want. How is 36 compared to 18 plus 18? Or 18 square square root 36 equals 36. It is a right triangle, and we also happen to know that it is isosceles also. All right, end of your notes.